Hello everyone, this is my third video in my Pokémon Ecology series, where I've been analyzing the Kanto games to figure out how the Pokémon likely behave as animals in the wild. I did make a sort of episode 2.5 in the form of my video on breeding and how Pokémon reproduction works, or rather doesn't, and at the end I mentioned plants, but didn't discuss any further. Basically, plants reproduce differently than animals, and so grass types should be treated differently, right? Well, type is an interesting thing. So, what can we actually extrapolate from the type of a Pokémon? Outside of niche interactions, type has three main effects. It determines weaknesses, resistances, and immunities. It gives same type attack bonus to moves of the same type, and certain types grant immunities to certain moves and status conditions, like ground type being immune to Thunder Wave. As can be seen with the fact that type has these consistent mechanical properties, type isn't an abstract concept, but a measurable trait that Pokémon can have. Magneton and the pre-Gen 5 fairies changing types after they were added does kind of put this into question, but that's a problem for another day. In terms of the specifics of these traits, while Stab does affect the offensive abilities of the Pokémon, it doesn't necessarily mean they have to have such moves. There are Pokémon that learn few or no moves of their type naturally, and others that learn lots of moves of types they aren't. Type is thus influenced by more passive aspects of the Pokémon, as opposed to their abilities. For most of the types, these aspects are not exclusive to a specific set of traits. Wings can be evolved in multiple ways, and thus the flying type can be as well. Same goes for poisonous or venomous Pokémon. For these types, while type can be used to justify relatedness, it's not the end-all be-all of it. Slugma and Charizard don't have to be closely related just because they share a type. If one Pokémon can develop the ability to control fire, and it's useful, it's likely that another will convergently evolve it. To me, I break down the types into two categories. Physical properties are, as I said, things that Pokémon are simply capable of, whether that's fighting prowess, having a hard shell, or control of elemental power. Ghost deserves a special mention because it's 100% a misnomer. Ghost types are not truly ghosts, they're not dead people or Pokémon. They're simply Pokémon that have developed seemingly ghost-like properties, like being semi-ethereal. I mean, they can reproduce. They can reproduce with non-ghosts. It'd be weird if they were ghosts. On the other side, though, are the tricky types. The ones that, on a much larger scale, seem to be actual clades of relatedness, as opposed to being traits of Pokémon. Bug being mostly terrestrial arthropods, and grass being plants. So what's going on with these guys? Why do we have these types which present related groups? Well, we can see a bit of what's going on in these two types I've put in the middle, water and dragon. Each have large portions which are a clade, fish in water, and reptile dragons in dragon, though both include Pokémon which clearly do not belong in these groups. Aquatic mammals in water, for example, and a number of non-reptile outliers in dragon. While a single group seems to take up the majority of these types, they aren't exclusive to said group. Bug and grass are the same, you just have to look closer. Even my description of them gave a clue to that. I described bug as mostly terrestrial arthropods. You can't describe it as bugs because most of them aren't. You can't describe it as insects because it includes spiders. You can't describe it as arthropods because it doesn't include most crustaceans, like Kingler. Even terrestrial arthropod doesn't quite work because terrestrial crabrawler aren't bug type, while aquatic anorith, along with a few others, are. You also have Shuckle, which probably isn't an arthropod at all, so it's not as monophyletic as it may seem. In some ways, grass is a little better. Everything in it has plant-like properties, and I can't think of any Pokemon with such properties that aren't grass type, other than the ones with a reason for it, like Sudowoodo. However, there is the realization to make that none are actually plants, and they're very clearly animals, kind of. Okay, they're not sessile autotrophs, like every plant basically. In grass, I see three groups. Firstly, the sentient plants. These are Pokemon which mostly seem like plants, but of course are mobile like animals. These include mons like Victorybell and Sunflora. The next is animals with plant-like properties. These properties may be more superficial and makes it more likely that they were just animals that gained these traits for one reason or another. This includes Pokemon like Chikorita and Tropheus. The final is symbiosis, i.e. an animal and a plant who are working together to create one Pokemon. The mushroom on the back of Parasect, for example, or the flower on the back of Venusaur. Oh, and another thing since I mentioned Parasect, a nail in the coffin of plant being monophyletic, fungi are not plants. Fungi in real life are more closely related to animals than they are to plants. So no, this is not a monophyletic group whatsoever. The other thing about these categories is that whether a Pokemon fits into them is mostly debatable. Lotad, for example. Is the lily pad a real plant that it grows? A superficial plant-looking growth? Or an actual lily pad that it has incorporated into its biology? I think any of these is arguable. However, because there are some, like Parasect, that are clearly one of the three, we necessarily cannot have the entirety of grass be one clade, as the different categories cannot be related. The arthropod part of Parasect would of course be related to other bug types, likely arachnids like spiders and scorpions. So, as I said early on, while the types are a useful tool for judging relatedness, they're not an all-encompassing groups, even for the ones that may seem like it. And so now, 6 minutes into the video, let's get started talking about the routes north of Cerulean City. We have a nice mix of Pokemon here on Route 24, with a good amount of change between the games. And it's right next to Route 25, which has almost exactly the same distributions. The encounter rates differ by no more than 5% for any given Pokemon. Because of this, I'm going to mesh the two routes together, and that brings us to a flaw with judging the areas on a route-by-route basis. Routes are somewhat arbitrary. They're designated and decided on by people who travel those areas, and while they often do correlate with the changes in the environment, this is a prime example of that not being the case. To the Pokemon, there's little to no difference, and that's what we care about. What the Pokemon decide is different. But, as a representation of nature, this is a great decision. It shows that the Pokemon aren't just defined by these routes, just like animals in real life aren't defined by arbitrary human delineation, but instead the actual environments of the world. So, actually starting to look at the games here, there seem to be 4 categories of Pokemon that exist in every game. These seem to be the niches that exist here, so let's go through them one by one. The first, the one that exists in every game, is Pidgey. I've talked a lot about Pidgey already, and the only real update I have to them is that I'm fairly certain they don't go out of their way to hunt other Pokemon. Likely just the occasional Caterpie, and that's probably only when they're Pidgeotto or Pidgeot. This is from the lack of good moves for this, and the fact that the bugs are in this area with them without major issue. Speaking of them being together, Weedle are here, but I use them as a reason why Pidgey aren't in Viridian Forest year-round. My excuse for this is that this is a matter of scale. Viridian Forest probably is teeming with Weedle when present, so much so that it's hard to avoid them, whereas here they're just another Pokemon in the environment, present, but avoidable. The encounter rates don't exactly show this, but the placement of grass does. No grass on these routes needs to be passed through in order to traverse them, but Viridian Forest has tons of grass which blocks your path, forcing you to encounter the bugs. So that's all well and good. Pidgey mainly eat regular plants and regular insects, but there's something a bit off here. These areas are on the edge of mountains with few trees. From both their description and what we've seen so far, it seems like this should be an area that Spearow live, not Pidgey. In fact, Spearow are nearby back in Route 4, where there are more trees? What exactly is going on here? Well, I think it has to do with human impact. The area Cerulean City is on likely used to be much more forested, and I believe a habitat for Pidgey. When the city was built, they lost a lot of that habitat, putting pressure on them. But that's not all. As I said last time, I believe Spearow are good urban adapters and are drawn to and thrive near cities. So, Cerulean drew in these Spearow, which, with their urban advantages, put further pressure on the Pidgey by outcompeting them. All of this forced the Pidgey away from the area, some of which likely are the ones living on routes 24 and 25. The next niche are the bugs, which are likely just sitting around eating plants as you'd expect them to, trying to eventually evolve all the way into Beedrill and Butterfree. Additionally, I think they're suffering from some of the same pressures that the Pidgey are. The habitat loss would obviously affect them too, but Spearow would be a completely different story. With, of course, their level 1 peck, they seem perfectly suited to start hunting bugs straight out of the nest, and they might even do enough damage to give Weedle little to no chance to poison sting them back, reducing the risk of hunting them. The bugs likely couldn't survive alongside Spearow, and followed Pidgey along up here north. Next, onto new Pokemon, the plants. So, considering their grass type, it's tempting to just label plants as autotrophs and leave it at that. But unlike the previous grass type I talked about, Tangela, they lack moves to allude to this. Neither have synthesis or ingrain, moves that would clearly designate them as autotrophs. Chlorophyll as an ability in Solar Beam suggests that they can use sunlight for something, but particularly in the case of Solar Beam, these are more offensive things as opposed to simply energy generation. So I don't think they make their own food. Instead, their food lies in the basis of Weeping Bell. They're carnivores. Being based on the pitcher plant, this is an easy thing to guess for the Bellsprout line, but it might not be as obvious for the Oddish. The thing is though, mechanically, it's easier to describe the differences between the lines than the similarities. With nearly identical move pools, very similar stat lines, the same ability, the same type, the same evolution method, and on top of that, with them living in the same area and seemingly being interchangeable, it's clear that whatever niche one holds, the other likely holds the same. A key move to their strategy likely lies in Sweet Scent, which of course is used to attract bugs, whether the animal or the Pokemon. They both have status moves to incapacitate prey from there, in particular Stun Spore, which is interestingly not shared by the other very similar Gen 1 grass poison type. From there, their strategies likely do differ a bit. Weeping Bell have Wrap and high attack, implying them to be physically stronger. I believe they use this to further attempt to subdue their prey, and perhaps swallow them whole, almost like a constrictor snake. In fact, since they get Sweet Scent very late, they perhaps start out with very similar behavior to one. Going back to the Oddish family then, Gloom has Absorb, a move clearly giving the idea that they're absorbing life, not from the soil and sun, but from other living things. However, a notable move they have is Moonlight. While it's mechanically identical to Synthesis, there's a clear different connotation to the theming of the move, and more importantly, it's not a move commonly learned by grass types. It easily could have been Synthesis, but the decision was made for it to be Moonlight instead. So there's some significance here, some sort of different delineation. They specifically do not have Synthesis. As mentioned previously, they share an evolution method, both being able to evolve with a Leaf Stone. I talked about Moonstones last time, but Moonstones have a nice clear place where it seems they come from. While it isn't as clear as Moonstones from Mount Moon, the remakes do add one of each stone to a thematically relevant area. To me, this does show that they are likely to some extent naturally occurring. While they may not be common, they likely are able to be consistently acquired, hence the fact that they're sold in department stores. Perhaps they're something akin to minerals that can be mined from specific locations. They likely have a similar effect to Moonstones, that being a sort of external chemical signal that can induce development. Because there's not that clear location they're from, I don't think it's something that will happen as often in the wild, or at all. Instead, Leaf, Fire, Thunder, and Waterstone evolution is likely something that only came about when humans started acquiring them, however they are acquired. So then the question is, what are the specifics of the development in these two cases? Examining the visuals of Weeping Bell into Victory Bell, there's a complete shift in posture, from a forward-facing mouth to an upward-facing one, the latter being much more akin to the pitcher plants they're based on, as if they're attaining a less active state. The combination of that, plus the very late Sweet Scent, make me believe that this is the evolutionary direction the species is headed. They're paramorphic, the opposite of paedomorphic. The hormone reaction to the leaf stones causes these developments, which are only starting to show up, to quickly present themselves fully. Eventually, over time, they might be able to evolve via level and won't need the leaf stones. What doesn't quite mesh with that idea though is the higher stats of Victory Bell. Why would a less active Pokemon need better stats, especially speed? My best solution for that is that the leaf stone is multifaceted to some degree. It also acts as a sort of a steroid, bumping up the physical abilities of the user. Moving back to the Oddish family, the only real visual difference between Gloom and Vileplume is the flower and facial expression, and the size. It's as if the flower has simply bloomed. In real life, blooming is a temporary thing for the purpose of reproduction. So what if Vileplume was something similar? What I'm suggesting here is that the leaf stone triggers premature entry into this bloomed stage, and keeps them there. We don't see any Vileplumes in the wild because there aren't actually any as a permanent stage. Without the leaf stone, it's just a brief flowering, which then they revert from. On top of that, like with Victory Bell, we can guess that it also strengthens the Pokemon in a way that the regular bloom doesn't, rationalizing the increase in size, and the large stat buffs. In my mind, the normal bloom would probably look like a cross between the Gloom and Vileplume, which could mean people might mistake it for the former. That makes sense for real-life plants where said flowering is for mating, but Gloom can already reproduce, so why need this stage? Let's put a pin in that for a moment. In terms of food, they likely prey upon whatever they can. Notably, their poison type means they don't fear the poison of Weedle, so probably insects, including but not limited to Pokemon ones. However, Gloom doesn't really have great moves for that though. Absorb being resisted by the bugs, and combined with the fact that they don't even get Mega or Giga Drain except as Vileplume, I think they might be limited to the non-Pokemon insects. Or, going straight off the type perspective, they may try to prey on things in the water, though I'm not sure how effective Sweet Scent would be there. These areas do have good access to water, thus they may absorb Magikarp or Poliwags that get too close to the edge, maybe drawn there by Sweet Scent. I'm going to look at all the ponds at once in the future, so I'll leave it at that for now, but if we continue to see Gloom only in areas with water, then this hypothesis could be justified. One last thing. Oddish is in Fire Red and Red at the same rate as Bellsprout is in Blue and Leaf Green, which is nothing special, they're version exclusives. But in Yellow, they're both present, and in pretty similar numbers to when they're each alone in the other games. This seems to imply that they actually have different niches, since they live so prominently together, if you assume that each game has the same amount of Pokemon in each area. If we instead work from the assumption that there are half as many Pokemon in Yellow, it would mean that together, they take up about the same as either does in their own games. But there's more to it than that. Pidgey are also about double the percent here, so having them makes their numbers more in line with the other games. So it seems like, more likely, Yellow just has fewer Pokemon there. More like it's missing one of the niches. Finally, the last niche, the Psychic type. Abra's lack of offensive abilities means it's either herbivorous or cared for by a parent. In Kadabra, Disable, Kinesis, and Reflect could be used to protect their young, so the latter seems likely. However, thanks to Teleport, Abra don't seem to really need a lot of protection. In fact, because Abra can teleport you as a field move, we can safely assume that a Kadabra could simply teleport any of their Abra young to safety when threatened. So these defensive moves probably are for their own defense. And if you can run so easily, the only reason you need defense is if running away would be counterproductive, like if you were hunting something. Of course, the more direct way to argue that they're predators is to look at their very high special attack and speed. But the more independent evidence for something, the stronger the hypothesis. Considering their type in this location, their most likely prey would be the poisonous plants. Their psychic moves should be able to easily deal with them. They do have a few adaptations that could pose a threat to Kadabra though. Status moves, for example, as seems to be very common. Synchronize as an ability, while not the ideal counter to status, would mean sleep wouldn't be as much of a death sentence, and paralyze wouldn't really change much in that fight, though it would mean they're still in danger until it wears off. Additionally, while Gloom and Weeping Bell aren't the ideal physical Pokemon, they do have some physical moves, and Kadabra has terrible physical bulk. Weeping Bell also has just enough speed to beat out Kadabra in the sunlight thanks to Chlorophyll, giving that ability some value. Chlorophyll may be the reason Kadabra's speed is so much higher than these potential prey, to try to minimize that chance of being slower in the sun. With its higher attack and speed, Weeping Bell does seem like it has some good adaptations to deal with Kadabra. Gloom has a few tricks though as well. Its higher bulk makes it more likely to survive attacks from Kadabra, And remember that weird suggestion that they temporarily become Vileplume? Well, when doing so, alongside stronger stats, they also get access to aromatherapy, which could counter the counter of Synchronize? It's a little convoluted, but what else would they really use it on here? So the transformation may be a sort of in-a-pinch mini mega evolution, where they get some nice little stat buffs and other abilities. Of course, that's all somewhat speculative since we don't see this occurring, but it's more interesting than just saying their evolution is just further development or another Neotness Pokemon, which is a far more reasonable interpretation, but I can't be boring and accurate all the time, can I? Speaking of evolution, Kadabra has one, a trait evolution. As I said with Golem, to me, trait evolutions are the clearest example of an evolution which requires human intervention. Something about the systems humans have designed for training Pokemon causes an imbalance of hormones and chemicals which causes this change. And like with Golem, I think it's probably Neotness. They used to evolve all the way to Alakazam, but no longer do so naturally. To that, and the other times I've suggested Neoteny, you may say, why? Why would something become weaker? That doesn't make sense, right? However, evolution, the real kind, doesn't work that way. It's not just a series of death matches to see what gets to reproduce where the strongest survives, it's a complex game of survival. More power might make you stronger and more able for you to beat things in a fight, but you might not need to fight things. Stronger also means more energy expended, and more energy means more food that you need, and if you need more food than you can get, you die. Kadabra is already very min-maxed for power. Alakazam is just more so. Great for trainers, not great in the wild. It is likely more successful to rein in that power and become more energy efficient. And so, Alakazam no longer exists in the wild, and Kadabra does. Oh yeah, Venonat are here. Pretty simple, right? They fill in the same role as the bugs, but in yellow, eating plants and acting as prey for other Pokemon. Well, though they share a type with Weedle and Caterpie, there's some unique differences here. Firstly, their evolution, evolving into their final form much later, but also being far more capable in their pre-evolved form, with an actual move pool and stats that rival other basic Pokemon here. Venonat clearly does much more than the other bugs. Notably, at a very similar level to where Kadabra gets it, Venonat gets Confusion, and Abra are absent in yellow. So rather than filling in the bugs niche, perhaps it fills in the psychic niche here. With that thought in mind, it would hunt the plants. Its confusion is weaker, it's only faster than Gloom, not Weepinbell, but it's immune to poison, and it has more physical bulk. So those may make up for it. Speaking of that poison immunity, from its poison typing, it has no more poison moves than Butterfree does, yet it has the type. This means it's not offensive, but defensive. So probably came about from this tendency to hunt poisonous prey. As mentioned, it also has status moves, which it could use to help in this, and these are made more accurate by Compound Eyes, an offensive ability, unlike the other bugs' defensive ones. An interesting aspect of that is Venomoth's lack of this ability, instead going back to the same defensive one that Weedle and Caterpie do, as if it swapped it with the latter. Anyways, that probably means Venomoth more focus on keeping themselves alive, though there's many different ways to take it from there. This is definitely a let's wait until we see more of them situation, and there's plenty of Venomoth to eventually see. So that's pretty much it, right? I guess I could start another route, but a lot of the nearby ones are grouped together, so I'd want to do them together. And this is the north of Cerulean City video, so... Oh yeah. Cerulean Cave is technically north of Cerulean City. Well, let's go in, shall we? It can't be that bad. Oh my. Oh no. Okay, so there's a lot going on in Cerulean Cave. It is by far the most diversity-rich area in the entire game, and diverse in very unusual ways. Most of the Pokemon here are fully evolved from level evolutions, with the previous stages not being present. And very interestingly, we find Wigglytuff and Raichu here, the only place we can find stone-evolved Pokemon. Some common cave Pokemon like Golbat and Paris are here, but we also have Pokemon that usually aren't found anywhere near caves, some that aren't even anywhere near here. And they change considerably between the games, at least across the gens. There's even a comment from an NPC acknowledging that very strong Pokemon are in the cave and that this is not what should be expected. All this screams that something is weird here. To me, the lack of the lower stages says that these Pokemon are not reproducing here. This isn't a place they live, they're just here for some reason, through migration. Of course, there's another weird Pokemon here as well, one very specific one. Mewtwo is our first legendary, and our first sexless Pokemon. So first off, what is Mewtwo? This is a good point to talk about the amount of weight I put into the overall Pokemon canon for the purposes of these analyses, which is basically none. The reason for that is twofold. One, many other mediums of Pokemon don't follow the same rules. In the anime, for example, there's that classic instance of Pikachu beating Onix with an electric move. That on its own shows that the games in the show don't use the same logic. If you saw that episode and thought, "Oh, that's so cool, I want to do that in the games," you'd be in for a terrible time. There are ways to beat Onix with Pikachu, but that is not one of them. That's just one example, but there's plenty of others which show that the games should stand alone when it comes to logic. 2, my goal here is not to completely describe exactly what's going on in the universe of Pokemon. My goal is to simply look at what we can divulge about Pokemon from how they exist in the games. It's like analyzing art and looking for themes, but rather than themes which relate to emotions and the human condition, they're ecological themes. So I don't care what the anime or manga or side games, or even really what other main series games yet describe about Mewtwo or any other Pokemon. Just what is said here in this game or these games. So, with that, we have 2 contradicting sources for Mewtwo's origins. The Pokédex suggests humans created it, and the notes in the Pokemon Mansion suggest that it was simply born of Mew. So, which is true? Well, the Pokédex should be more reliable than a bunch of notes left in a burned building, right? Maybe those notes were planted to trick people into thinking Mewtwo wasn't created. It's a big government cover-up by Blaine and a bunch of other people. Ooh, they're just lying around an abandoned building full of people. They should take them, right? On the other hand, I don't trust the Pokédex, especially under the context of this analysis. Paris, for example, explicitly stated in the Pokédex that the mushroom is parasitic, which is fine narratively, but as I concluded in my Mount Moon video, based on the mechanics, it makes much more sense to be a mutualistic relationship. With Paris and Parasec's names referring to parasitism, it's likely a misconception in the Pokemon universe. They're thought to be parasitic, but aren't. In that context, the Pokédex doesn't reveal the truth, but instead can be as flawed and incorrect as a regular encyclopedia. And 3. I'm not interested in discussing lore and story. I'm interested in the ludonarrative. I don't care what they want to try to tell about Pokemon. I care what they did tell about Pokemon, or what they showed about Pokemon. Text can be wrong, mechanics can only be misinterpreted. So with that said, it doesn't really matter which is true about Mewtwo. Either way, it's not from here, it's weird, it's an invasive species, if a single creature could be referred to as such. For the purpose of this ecological analysis, it doesn't matter how it came to be. The ecology of Mewtwo is kind of non-existent. It's not something that evolved, it effectively is an invasive species, and one that may not even be able to breed. It does seem to have a large effect on its environment though, perhaps. As I said, this is a weird area with oddly strong Pokemon. But we always have to remember our correlation versus causation problem, and ask, is Mewtwo the reason they're here, or are they both here for the same reason? Or even is Mewtwo here because they're here? However, other than Mewtwo and the potential for humans stalking the cave, there isn't really a good reason that we can see for these Pokemon to be drawn here. Mewtwo is kind of the best explanation. Of course, Mewtwo itself isn't a great explanation because nothing mechanical about Mewtwo would hint to it drawing in powerful Pokemon. So I have to leave this as an overall question mark. Something we can't see is going on here, whether it's Mewtwo or something else in the cave. Oh, and For food, Mewtwo, considering its level, probably eats whatever it wants, with little risk of predation against itself, especially considering it has Recover and Safeguard to keep itself healthy. For the rest of the cave, there's not really a good reason to go into it. It'd be better to talk about these Pokemon when they come up in their own environments. One thing of note is that the reason we probably see the cave-based Pokemon following the same trend of only being the fully evolved forms is that they have to react to these Pokemon coming in. If strong Pokemon are invading your cave, the weaker Zubat in Paris are going to be kicked out or eaten. Finally done another one. I really thought this one would be shorter. Next time I'm going to take a right at Cerulean City and cover what I guess I'm going to call the Rock Tunnel Valley. Rock Tunnel, the power plant, the areas around that. So I guess I'll see you next time. I mean, if you watched 3 of these videos, I suppose you're probably interested in seeing more. But, or if you got this far in the video and you didn't watch the other ones, you're probably interested. Yeah. Thanks for coming. Bye. Oh, wait, can I talk about the fact that Oddish has a Latin name? Like, that's weird. Does the family all share that Latin name? Or did they're called different species. Do they have a different species name? Are they all the Odium family? But they're not all Odium wanderus? Also, this isn't right. The wanderus should not be capitalized. It's capital the genus and don't capital the species. There's so much wrong with this, and there's so many questions that it brings up. Why is this here?